Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. Sometimes history changes not because of wars, not because of ideas, not because of the decisions of rulers, but because of the rustle of rats, the bite of a flea, the fear that spreads faster than the disease itself. In this video, we will tell the story of how the plague came to Europe and stayed there for centuries. You will hear about cities that became empty within days, about people who buried entire families, about those who sought salvation. In faith, in flight, or in violence. We will show how medicine was born, how doctors in leather masks appeared on the streets, and how fear turned into memory. This will be a story about a world that survived death and became something different. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments, and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. When ancient chroniclers tried to describe the disasters that befell their cities, they rarely understood what they were facing. Diseases came suddenly, like a curse or divine punishment, carrying away entire generations and leaving behind only grim silence and emptiness. One of the most terrible and persistent of these shadows, which had followed humanity since time immemorial, was the plague. Unknown, dreadful, yet tangible, returning again and again through history, destroying, transforming, and leaving traces in the memory of nations. The first, still unconscious encounters with the plague can already be found in the monuments of ancient Egypt. In papyri, dating to the 18th dynasty, around the 14th century before our era, there are descriptions of outbreaks marked by sudden death, swellings, and fever. Similar mentions appear in the curses of Tura and in the annals of the Ramessides, where the destruction of entire settlements was explained not by war, but by some rotting pestilence that penetrated human bodies. Traces of these epidemics can also be found in the Old Testament, the plagues that struck the Egyptians in the book of Exodus, the pestilence that killed tens of thousands among the Israelites, the death of the Philistines who had taken the Ark of the Covenant, and the sores on their bodies. All of this is likely the echo of outbreaks that would later receive a scientific name, but were then surrounded by myth, fear, and sacred horror. On Mesopotamian clay tablets, in the libraries of Assyria, Babylon, and Sumer, there are spells against the breath of death and mentions of dark spots upon the skin. These were attributed to evil spirits, the southern wind, or the wrath of the gods of the underworld. Epidemics also appear in royal chronicles. Inscriptions of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal speak of death without battle that swept through the camps of soldiers. These records were far from medicine, yet they convey something important: the perception of disease as a blind, total force that spared neither king nor slave. However, it was in ancient Greece that illness was first described in detail and almost rationally. In the middle of the 5th century before our era, during the Peloponnesian War, Athens experienced a catastrophe that, according to contemporaries, was worse than any military disaster. In the year 431 before our era, when the Spartans began the siege of Attica, Athenians fled within the long walls of their city. Refugees from nearby villages and distant towns crowded inside, and in the heat, filth, and scarcity of water, the epidemic broke out. Today, historians suggest various possibilities, from typhoid fever to the Ebola virus, but at that time, people knew neither the name nor the cause. They only saw how, day after day, their loved ones perished and entire streets disappeared. The Athenian historian Thucydides, who survived the illness himself, left a unique testimony. He wrote that the disease began suddenly, with fever, thirst, redness of the eyes, and nosebleeds. The body became covered with sores, breathing turned foul, and the mind clouded. People threw themselves into wells, unable to bear the inner fire. They died on the 3rd or 4th day, some later, but in torment. Those who survived often lost limbs, sight, or sanity. Thucydides observed that those who had already been sick did not fall ill again, an observation that, many centuries later, would form the foundation of the concept of immunity. He also noted that among the dead was Pericles, the great statesman and symbol of Athenian democracy. By various estimates, Athens lost between 1/4 and 1/3 of its population. The epidemic broke the city's spirit, destroyed its traditions, and made its laws meaningless. People burned bodies without rites, abandoned the sick, and lived from day to day, no longer believing in gods or justice. 6 centuries later, the Roman Empire faced another blow. In the middle of the 2nd century of our era, during the reign of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, an epidemic broke out, later known as the Antonine Plague. According to accounts, the disease came from the east, from Parthia, where Roman legions had waged war. At first, it spread through Syria and Asia Minor, then reached the Balkans, Greece, Egypt, Italy, and Gaul. Its symptoms were high fever, rash, ulcers, sore throat, and weakness. Modern researchers believe it might have been smallpox or a severe form of measles. Marcus Aurelius, despite personal grief and the loss of comrades, continued to write his meditations, lines filled with stoic calm in the face of catastrophe. He mentioned cities where so many had died that there were not enough living to bury the dead. The empire lost citizens, soldiers, officials, craftsmen. According to some estimates, as many as 15 million people perished. The economy weakened, borders became vulnerable, and barbarian tribes pressed harder. Yet the most devastating blow of antiquity came a century later, during the reign of Emperor Justinian. In the spring of the year 541, in Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium, an epidemic erupted that engulfed the entire Eastern Roman Empire and entered history as the Plague of Justinian, the first documented pandemic in European history. The historian Procopius of Caesarea wrote of terrible swellings in the groin and underarms, of madness that seized the sick before death, of nightmares and hallucinations. The disease advanced rapidly, killing within 2 or 3 days. Bodies were left unburied, thrown into cisterns, dumped into the sea, or abandoned in the streets. On some days, according to Procopius, as many as 10,000 people died. Emperor Justinian himself fell ill and nearly died, but survived. The plague returned in waves. For the next 2 centuries, it struck cities of both east and west again and again. Modern estimates suggest that about 50 million people died, nearly half the population of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa at the time. Trade stopped. Cities emptied. Fields went untilled. The empire lost control of its territories and barbarian invasions resumed. Many historians believe this pandemic was one of the key reasons Byzantium could never restore the Roman Empire's former unity. Yet the plague left behind more than destruction. In people's hearts arose a new sense of impermanence. The first attempts appeared to trace connections between trade routes and outbreaks, to describe symptoms, to keep records. In culture, the image of death began to take shape, not as a natural end, but as a spontaneous, annihilating force. And although from the late 8th century the plague vanished from European chronicles, it did not vanish from the world. It waited, hidden in the mountains of Tibet, in the steppes of Central Asia, in the bodies of fleas and rodents. Its next return would be not a local disaster, but one of planetary scale. When the plague of Justinian disappeared from the chronicles, more than 5 centuries passed. The disease seemed to dissolve into the dust of history. Temples again filled with prayers, markets with merchants' voices, and European doctors considered the calamities of the distant past finally overcome. But deep in Asia, in the valleys of Tibet, in the deserts of Tarim, in the mountains of China and the steppes of Mongolia, the disease still lived, unseen and waiting, like a spark beneath ashes. In the 13th century, a vast empire arose across Eurasia, the Mongol Empire. The descendants of Genghis Khan subdued lands from the shores of the Yellow Sea to the Russian forests, from the Persian Gulf to the Danube. Never before had East and West been so tightly connected. Caravans, couriers, merchants, diplomats, and craftsmen traveled constantly along the Great Silk Road, bringing with them everything that movement brings: ideas, goods, animals, and disease. On the western slopes of Tibet and in the highlands of Qinghai lived marmots whose burrows sheltered fleas carrying an invisible enemy, a bacterium that 6 centuries later would be named Yersinia pestis. From marmots to rats, from rats to carts, from carts to warehouses and ships, thus began the journey of invisible death. In the early 14th century, in China under the Yuan dynasty founded by Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, chroniclers recorded vast disasters. In the provinces of Hubei and Hunan, they described a terrifying epidemic marked by fever, swellings, hemorrhages, and sudden death. Some sources claim that as much as 90% of the population in certain areas perished. China descended into turmoil. Rebellions, famine, and plague walked hand in hand. From central China, the disease moved west, through Xinjiang and eastern Turkestan, through the oases of Khotan and Yarkand, reaching Samarkand and Bukhara. There, in the crossroads of Central Asia, where eastern caravans met merchants from Iran, the Caucasus, and the Golden Horde, the second great wave of the plague began. Persian chronicles of the mid-14th century, such as those of Wasaf and Mustafi, describe a deadly pestilence along the Amu Darya and Sir Darya. Towns lost all inhabitants, and only dogs and jackals scattered bones in the streets. Markets once filled with trade became cemeteries. Grave diggers themselves became victims. The city of Sarai, capital of the Golden Horde on the Lower Volga, played a crucial role in the spread. Sarai became Eurasia's greatest trade hub, linking China, the Caucasus, Rus, and Iran. From here, merchants carried goods westward to Crimea, where Genoese colonies thrived, especially the port of Kaffa, today's Feodosia. In the year 1346, Khan Janabeg of the Golden Horde laid siege to Genoese Kaffa, a vital trading post on the Black Sea. The siege lasted for months, but soon a deadly plague broke out among the Khan's troops. Thousands died of a mysterious disease with swellings, fever, and bodily decay. Italian chronicles claim that Janabeg, in fury, ordered the corpses of the dead to be catapulted over the city walls to infect those inside. Whether this was the first act of biological warfare is debated, but the fact remains. An outbreak began inside the city. Terrified, the Genoese fled by sea. In the holds of their ships they carried bales of cloth, barrels of grain, cages of birds, and, unknowingly, black rats carrying infected fleas. In the autumn of 1347, the first ships from Kaffa reached the ports of the Black and Mediterranean seas. Their routes diverged. Some sailed to Constantinople, others to Venetian colonies, others to Messina in Sicily or to Marseille. From each port new waves spread, each bearing not only trade, but death itself, now moving toward Europe. Meanwhile, the disease advanced overland, through Armenian lands, along roads between Tiflis and Erzurum, through the ports of Trebizond and Sinope, into Asia Minor, and toward Byzantine borders. The fragmented Balkans became the next stage of infection. The plague moved slowly but relentlessly. Each city it reached became a new source. Each marketplace, where rats found grain and shelter, became an incubator. Each caravan, ship, and merchant became not only a carrier of goods but of death. When in Messina, as eyewitnesses wrote, dock workers began to die, then sailors, then passers-by. The city tried to close its harbor, but it was too late. Ships had already sailed for Genoa, Venice, Pisa, Tunis, and Majorca. Routes of infection intertwined like a web, carrying one of the deadliest diseases in human history. While Europe still lived in ignorance, trusting in peace and stability, while doctors debated the balance of bodily humors, the plague was already walking the streets of ports, creeping into monasteries and granaries, and soon it would reach the great cities. But the true catastrophe, the Black Death, was only beginning. In the autumn of 1347, several Genoese ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina after sailing from Kaffa. Almost the entire crew was dead. Only a few sailors remained alive, burning with fever, their bodies covered with dark spots, their armpits and groins swollen to the size of a hen's egg. Their breathing was labored, their voices faint. When the townspeople boarded to unload cargo, they did not yet know they were witnessing the beginning of one of humanity's greatest tragedies. The disease had no name. No one could explain it or stop it. It spread with terrifying speed. Within days, it reached Palermo and Catania, then Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. From there, to Florence, Avignon, and Lyon. By the spring of the next year, it had reached Paris, Barcelona, Mainz, and Prague, and within 2 more years, London, Edinburgh, Oslo, and Novgorod. In 6 years, it covered almost all of Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East. The Venetian chronicler Andrea Dandolo wrote that the illness began suddenly. In the morning, a person felt only mild discomfort. By evening, fever rose. The next day, painful swellings, buboes, appeared. They festered, causing unbearable agony. Then came convulsions, bloody coughing, delirium, and death on the 3rd or 4th day, sometimes within 24 hours. The chronicler Giovanni di Coppo of Perugia wrote that people fell dead in the streets, and no one dared to approach. Mothers abandoned their sick children, brothers refused to bury sisters, priests refused to give last rites. Pope Clement VI, residing in Avignon, ordered bodies burned in huge pits outside the city and shut himself in a stone chamber surrounded by fires to purify the air. Silence descended upon the streets of Europe. Trade ceased. Butchers, bakers, laundresses, and barbers vanished. Churches, workshops, and schools closed. Bells rarely tolled. There was no one left to ring them. Where life had once thrived, only coughing and dogs' howls remained. In the English city of York, parish records show that more than half the inhabitants died in a single week. In Florence, according to Giovanni Boccaccio's chronicles, mortality was so high that 10 or 12 bodies were laid in one pit and barely covered with earth. He wrote that corpses were heaped on carts like firewood and taken outside the city, where names, rank, and origin no longer mattered. Across Europe's villages, a lone gravedigger dug graves for enormous pay but seldom survived the week. In some villages, the survivors fled to forests. In others, no one remained at all. The plague spared no one. Peasants and nobles, monks and priests, women and children, all perished. The poor, living in filth and crowding, died first, but soon the disease reached castles and monasteries. Mortality was highest in densely populated cities, especially those engaged in trade. There were even more dreadful forms. Beyond the bubonic plague, there was the pneumonic form, spread by air, killing within 1 or 2 days without swellings, only choking, coughing, and blood. There was also the septicemic form, which killed before any outward sign appeared. In northern France, the chronicler Jean de Venette wrote that in one monastery, all 47 monks died within 2 weeks, leaving only one brother alive to record how each night he carried the dead away, then lay down in his cell awaiting his turn. In Sweden, entire parishes lost all their priests. In Ireland, whole clans vanished. In German lands, monasteries and mines were abandoned en masse. In Iceland, up to 2/3 of the population perished. In England, nearly half. And in Italian cities like Siena, mortality reached 60%. Modern historians, studying tax rolls, wills, parish lists, and land records, conclude that during 6 years of the pandemic, between 25 and 50 million people died, roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. The chronicles of that time are filled not only with facts, but with horror. People lost not only their loved ones, but the sense of the future. Monks repeatedly wrote the same thought: the end of times. Some believed death was purification, others punishment, many inevitability. There was no war, no invasion, no famine, and yet cities emptied. In that silence, in dying alleys, under church vaults where no one remained to hold mass, Europe faced for the first time the feeling of its own vulnerability before an invisible force that could neither be seen, predicted, nor stopped. By the summer of 1353, the plague began to recede. It had taken millions of lives, destroyed families and cities, and shattered the foundations of society. Yet its trace endured. People were no longer the same. The world they lived in had changed forever. When the first waves of the Black Death swept across European lands, destroying cities and villages and wiping out entire lineages and communities, the survivors found themselves not only face to face with fear, but with a void of meaning. Neither knowledge, nor weapons, nor prayers could explain what was happening. The poor died, and the noble died, the righteous and the sinful alike. Monasteries stood empty, churches turned into storehouses for bodies, and prayers seemed powerless. In that silence between despair and the desire to understand, mass madness was born. People began to seek culprits, to search for a cause, to look for any kind of order in what felt like the end of the world. First and foremost, the blow fell upon those who had always lived nearby, but were traditionally seen as outsiders. Above all, upon Jewish communities. Chronicles preserve dozens of accounts of how fear of the plague quickly turned into rage. In German and French towns, rumors spread that Jews were poisoning wells, bringing disease by secret powders or incantations. In the city of Toulon, in the south of France, in the year 1348, a mob burst into the Jewish quarter and killed several dozen people. In Freiburg, in Switzerland, the entire Jewish community was arrested. The men were tortured, and under duress they confessed to a pact with diabolical forces. On the basis of these confessions, hundreds were burned at the stake. In Mainz, Strasbourg, Cologne, Erfurt, and other cities, thousands of Jews were killed. Their property was confiscated, their homes looted, and those who managed to flee were barred from entering neighboring towns. In some places, such as Nuremberg, city authorities tried to protect the Jewish population, but under pressure from the crowd, they surrendered them. The Roman Curia officially opposed lynchings. Pope Clement VI issued a bull explicitly stating that Jews suffered from the plague on a par with Christians and could not be its cause. But fear proved stronger than words, and in a number of regions, such as Provence and Aragon, Pogroms continued for several years. While some sought an external enemy, others sought an internal one. The streets of European cities filled with people in rags, barefoot, their backs torn by whips. They were called flagellants, from the Latin flagellum, a scourge. These were men and women who believed the plague was punishment for the sins of all humanity, and that only self-mortification could appease the wrath of God. They moved from town to town in columns of 40 to 60 people, singing psalms and lashing themselves with iron scourges, leaving wounds from which blood flowed. Each evening they lay down cross-shaped on the ground and listened to sermons about the coming end. They rejected the authority of priests and believed that truth could be found only through suffering. In Cologne, Würzburg, Metz, Utrecht, and other cities, the flagellants drew crowds. Their processions inspired fear and awe. Sometimes pogroms flared after they passed through. Sometimes the epidemic waned and people believed that their suffering had truly helped. But church authorities soon declared the movement heretical. In the year 1350, the Pope forbade flagellant processions under threat of excommunication. Alongside violence and fanaticism came a wave of prophecies. On the streets wandered angels of death, dressed in black, faces hidden beneath hoods. They proclaimed the imminent end of the world, spoke of the sins of nations, of divine judgment, and of the return of Christ. Ordinary people fell to their knees, confessed, sold their possessions, abandoned their children, and went into the wilderness. Monks in monasteries wrote letters to one another steeped in despair. One such text from a Franciscan house in Padua read, "We are losing not only brothers, we are losing the light. There are no books left, no prayer, only the smell of decay and fear of breathing." The church was powerless. Thousands of priests died. In some parishes there was no one to bury the dead, no one to hear confessions. In their desperation, people turned to relics, to holy remains, to wonder-working icons. Pilgrims traveled to shrines in hope of salvation, but brought with them only new sources of infection. Rumors of miraculous healings alternated with tales of curses. In Naples, they spoke of a monk who foretold the date of his own death and the ruin of the entire city. In Brittany, legends spread about a woman in black who heralded the coming of the plague. In Languedoc, people claimed that at night they heard the voices of the dead calling them away. Archaic fears were reborn across Europe. People once again believed in witches, in the evil eye, in the power of the stars. Astrologers argued about planetary influences. They spoke of an ominous conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter that had occurred in March of the year 1345, and supposedly foretold the destruction of humankind. Charlatans appeared in the streets. Some offered amulets, others special prayers, still others powders made from the bones of saints. Some insisted the disease came from smells and sold pouches filled with lavender, rosemary, and wormwood. None of it helped. The world was going mad. Rationality vanished. Faith ceased to be consolation and became fuel for panic. People searched for the guilty, and most often found them nearby. They sought explanations, and most often turned to forces that could neither save nor stop anything. The plague brought not only death but a rupture with the old system of coordinates. The old world, in which a priest knew the road to salvation, in which the stars revealed fate, in which ritual ordered chaos, proved powerless. In its place arose the feeling that the human being was no longer protected. When the first wave of the Black Death receded, leaving behind deserted villages, vacant houses, and heaps of bodies dumped haphazardly on city outskirts, fear did not disappear. On the contrary, it changed form. People began to realize that prayers had not halted death, that familiar rites and beliefs had protected neither the rich nor the poor. And so, for the first time in European consciousness, the thought arose. Perhaps one can not only hide from pestilence or pray against it, but also try to defend oneself in an organized way. Thus began the long and painful birth of epidemiological thinking. One of the first cities to intuit this need was Venice, a trading republic bound to the east by hundreds of shipping routes. Already in the middle of the year we now call 1348, the Venetian authorities issued an order forbidding disembarkation from arriving vessels until a set period had passed. Initially it was 20 days, then it increased to 30, and later to 40. It was this number, quaranta in Italian, that gave rise to the word quarantine. At first the rule applied only to ships, but later it extended to cargo and to people. On the small island of Lazaretto Vecchio, in the lagoon opposite Venice, the first isolation facilities in history were built. Their passengers and crews from regions afflicted by disease were housed temporarily. There, too, cargoes were stored, especially cloth, wool, feathers, and spices, everything thought capable of absorbing poisonous air. Other port cities quickly adopted Venice's example. Genoa, Ragusa, Pisa, Marseille. Temporary bans on trade, on the movement of goods, on fairs and festivals came into force. Special civic guards appeared in the streets to enforce sanitary measures. Merchants were forbidden to leave their ships, sometimes under pain of death. Milan went even further. As chroniclers note, houses in which a sick person appeared were bricked up from the outside. Masons, acting on the authorities' orders, sealed doors and windows with bricks, regardless of whether people inside were still alive. The measure was regarded as cruel, but many contemporaries conceded that thanks to such actions, Milan endured the epidemic with fewer losses than other great Italian cities. The first forms of registering the sick appeared. City governments began to keep lists of the infected, the dead, and the recovered. Crosses were painted on facades of houses where plague had struck. Barrels of vinegar were set up in squares. Coins were dropped into them to be disinfected before buying bread. People carried scented cloths soaked in vinegar and lavender and hung pouches of rosemary, wormwood, and juniper around their necks. The air was to be purified by fire, smoke, and aromas, since the principal cause of illness was considered to be a poisonous miasmatic fog. It was in these years that an image was born which would be forever imprinted in Europe's collective memory, the figure of the plague doctor. In Latin, medicus pestis. He was not just a physician, but a specialist hired by city authorities, often for high pay and with a promise of compensation to his family in case of his death. At first, they looked no different from ordinary doctors. Gradually, a special outfit emerged. A broad-brimmed hat as a badge of the profession, a leather mask with a long beak, inside which were sponges soaked in aromatic oils and herbs, glass lenses shielding the eyes, a long, often waxed cloak covering the body, leather gloves on the hands. This attire was meant to protect against bad air. The beaked mask resembled a bird, and in popular memory that bird-like figure became a symbol of death. But beneath the mask was a person, receiving the sick, watching the dying, compiling lists, witnessing death, writing reports. A doctor, often doomed, yet still trying. We know the names of some of them. For example, Jean-Jacques Monget, a physician in Marseille who described the course of the epidemic in detailed notes, or Guy de Chauliac, physician to Pope Clement VI, who observed the spread of the disease in Avignon. Their writings became sources for understanding symptoms and transmission. Plague boards also appeared, advisory bodies that included doctors, city officials, and notaries. They made decisions to close markets, suspend services, organize temporary lazarettos, and distribute bread and firewood in quarantined quarters. Many measures seemed barbaric, often failed, and frequently provoked resistance. People obeyed reluctantly, hid sick relatives, bribed officials, and fled infected towns, carrying the disease along the roads. Yet amid these contradictions, mistakes, and fears, a new attitude toward illness slowly took shape. Not as a purely spiritual punishment, but as a material threat that could and should be fought. Even if medicine still rested on the doctrine of the four humors and bloodletting remained a principal remedy, the very fact of observation, the attempts at systematization, the recording of symptoms, and the tracing of connections between movement and outbreaks, all of this laid the foundations for a future scientific approach. Large-scale quarantines did not save Europe from disaster, but they established the basis of sanitary law. It was then that documents began to record merchants' routes, their cargoes, and points of contact. Authorities started monitoring water cleanliness, waste removal, and burial grounds. What seems obvious today was, in the 14th century, a revelation. Thus, out of fear, despair, and death, arose the first efforts to confront an epidemic as a public catastrophe and not merely a spiritual one. Europe took a step, not yet toward medicine as we know it, but toward a way of thinking in which a person assumes responsibility not only for the soul, but for the health of others. When the Black Death loosened its grip and ceased to claim thousands of lives each day, Europe did not return to the old order. The peoples who had passed through the epidemic found themselves in a different world, not merely emptied and silent, but structurally altered. The disease had not only reduced the population, it had torn apart the social, economic, and cultural bonds on which the entire civilization rested. Until the middle of the 14th century, much of Europe lived within a feudal framework, in which land was the principal source of wealth, and the peasantry its driving force. But after the epidemic, which had killed from 1/3 to 1/2 of the population, the old systems no longer functioned. Villages emptied, fields went to weeds, and barons lost not only income, but control over people. Now it was not the landholder who dictated terms, but the peasant, if he had survived. There were not enough hands to work, and every living person became valuable. For the first time in centuries, rural folk began moving from one manor to another, demanding wages, refusing labor services, and asking that old obligations be abolished. In England, these changes produced acute social tension. In the year 1361, the so-called Statute of Laborers was enacted, forbidding workers to demand pay higher than what it had been before the plague. But 2 decades later, in the year 1381, came the Great Peasants' Revolt, which engulfed London and several counties. Although it was suppressed, the very fact of such a mass uprising showed that the old order was collapsing. Similar processes unfolded in France, in the Holy Roman Empire, and in northern Italy. Monasteries emptied, clerical schools lost students, while cities began to gain strength. Monetary exchange grew in importance. Rent and contractual labor expanded. Increasingly, peasants left for towns where they could find work as artisans, servants, clerks, and builders. Cities that had suffered grievous losses began to revive faster than the countryside. Paris, Florence, London, Bruges, Lubeck, all grew during the second half of the 14th century thanks to migration and the expansion of craft production. New guilds, workshops, and associations appeared. The first forms of collective labor agreements emerged. The plague also altered the philosophy of life. Before the epidemic, death was seen as something expected, governed by ritual and subordinated to a religious order. Afterward, it became unpredictable and total. People saw priests and monks die, those who confessed and took communion, while others who lived in sin and ignored commandments survived. It was then that the cultural image of the dance of death arose, skeletons leading away bishops, kings, merchants, peasants, women, and infants. In churches and on city walls, painters depicted scenes in which death chose no one. It simply came. Painting grew more realistic, at times even harsh. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, wrote his Decameron, a cycle of tales in which young people, having fled the epidemic to a country house, share stories of love, betrayal, humor, loss, and salvation. In those stories lies a new attitude toward life. It is fleeting yet full of meaning. It can end on any day, but while it lasts, it must be lived. Philosophers began to doubt the prior order of things. Texts increasingly touched on loneliness, the loss of meaning, and mistrust of authority. Some blamed humanity for the catastrophe, others blamed God, and others fell silent. A crisis of faith arose, but with it a movement toward personal responsibility. In universities where teachers had survived, lectures resumed, but the listeners were different. Many students had endured the epidemic, lost their families, and no longer saw knowledge as an abstract game. Interest grew in medicine, law, and the natural sciences. Gradually, from the end of the 14th century onward, works appeared that described disease not as heavenly punishment, but as a physical phenomenon, dependent on environment, body, and behavior. Anatomy entered a new era. In Padua, Bologna, and Montpellier, universities that had weathered the epidemic, the first public dissections were held. Physicians began to draw diagrams of the body, to identify organs, to discuss how precisely death entered the flesh. Knowledge was still rudimentary, but a method took shape in which truth was sought not in texts, but in observation. Death, once only feared, became an object of reflection. Literature embraced memento mori, reminders of mortality, not as threats, but as sources of wisdom. Engravings showed hourglasses, skulls, and withering flowers. This symbolism seeped into everyday objects, rings, mirrors, wall clocks. Paradoxically, amid fear, interest in life grew. Painting admitted more light, music became more melodic, architecture reached for brightness and height. The desire for beauty increased. Those who had survived death sought pleasure not as sin, but as part of the human path. A new attitude toward work formed. Once seen as drudgery, it now became a source of meaning and a chance to change one's station. From the devalued peasant emerged the figure of the worker, the craftsman, the specialist. Thus the Black Death, having left millions dead, shattered not only bodies but former meanings. Yet from that ash, a new outlook began to sprout. On life, on the human being, on reason. And although the Renaissance still lay decades ahead, its roots reached back into that quiet after the scream. When the Black Death vanished from the chronicles of the mid-14th century and Europe entered the 15th century, many believed the catastrophe would never return. Yet the plague did not disappear. It merely changed its roots, settled in ports, in rodents' nests, in warehouses, and from time to time reminded people of itself with new outbreaks. Over the next 3 centuries, with frightening regularity, Europe again and again felt the breath of this disease. The gravest later epidemics came in the 17th and 18th centuries. Despite rising literacy, the construction of hospitals, and the emergence of the first sanitary rules, people still did not know the true cause of the illness. The miasma theory of corrupted air remained dominant, and when the plague returned, fear and panic repeated themselves almost exactly as they had 2 centuries earlier. The Great Plague of London, which seized the city in the year 1665, was the last truly devastating outbreak in the British Isles. Its harbingers appeared at the end of the previous year, when paupers and itinerant traders in the poor districts of the eastern part of the capital began to die. At first the deaths were isolated, but by spring the number of burials rose sharply. The city council, drawing on memories of earlier epidemics, tried to act. Houses where people died were locked for 40 days. A red cross was painted on the door with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Watchmen were paid to ensure no one left these dwellings, but they often died themselves, and then the houses were left unguarded. Silence fell over London's streets, broken only by carts carrying the dead. Bodies were taken away at night, sometimes in the presence of a priest, more often without any rite. Graves were common pits, and bodies were laid in them by the dozens. Diaries of eyewitnesses survive. The most famous is the diary of Samuel Pepys, an Admiralty official, who day after day described how the streets grew empty, how people fled the city, how even friends stopped shaking hands. He wrote of the smell of lime in the churchyards, of the total absence of confidence in tomorrow, of the fear of touch. The wealthy left the capital. King Charles II himself moved his court to Oxford, but servants, the poor, traders, women, and children remained. Bread grew dearer in the markets. Coal deliveries ceased, workshops shut down. Preachers called for repentance, physicians advised fumigating houses with herbs, but mortality only climbed. By the autumn of the year 1665, as many as 7,000 people a week were dying in London. In some parishes, several hundred per day. In all, according to modern historians, about 80,000 people perished, roughly 1/5 of the city's population. The epidemic began to ebb with the onset of winter. People believed the cold air dispersed the miasmas. In reality, the seasonal behavior of the fleas that transmitted the plague and a partial breaking of chains of contagion played their part. London began to recover, but in the very next year, another calamity awaited it. The Great Fire, which destroyed a large part of the city, including districts where the plague had raged most fiercely. In France, the last major outbreak came more than half a century later, in the year 1722. This was the famous epidemic in Marseille. Into a port full of life came ships from the Levant. One of them, the Grand Saint-Antoine, brought bales of cloth and spices, but also, invisibly, death. Despite alarming reports of deaths among the crew, the vessel was allowed to unload, under pressure from merchants unwilling to lose their cargo. Almost immediately, dock workers began to die, then craftsmen, then shopkeepers. The disease spread rapidly. The city authorities belatedly tried to impose measures: quarantine, isolation, a ban on leaving the city, sanitary cordons. But it was too late. Altogether, according to various estimates, between 80,000 and 100,000 people died in the Marseille plague, including inhabitants of surrounding villages. One contemporary, the monk Jean-Baptiste Berton, left a grim account. The dead lay on staircases, in doorways, on rooftops. Priests heard confessions of the dying while standing outside their doors. Burials took place in trenches dusted with quicklime. Some neighborhoods never returned to life. People preferred to abandon them. After Marseille, major plague epidemics no longer returned to France. It was the final, tolling bell. From the 18th century onward, the disease began to lose its power. Not because it grew weaker, but because people finally began to understand how to fight it. In different countries, systems of sanitary cordons came into force, along borders, around ports, on trade routes. Military patrols forbade movement without permission. In Austria, in parts of Italy, and in the Ottoman Empire, quarantine stations became mandatory. By the end of the 19th century, the plague still existed, but on the periphery. It flared in India, China, Madagascar, and Mongolia. In Europe, there remained only memories, fears, and traces in the collective mind. A definitive scientific explanation came only at the very end of the century. In the year 1894, during an outbreak in Hong Kong, the Swiss physician Alexandre Yersin, working for the Pasteur Institute, first isolated the causative agent, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, later named in his honor. He demonstrated its transmission by fleas living on rats. This discovery was a turning point. For the first time, people could see the enemy. From that moment, the fight against the plague moved from the realm of religious rites and intuitive bans into the realm of exact science. Vaccines, sanitation, rodent control, international medical agreements. All of these became realities thanks to Yersin's work. But it took more than 5 centuries of fear, suffering, and self-reproach to reach that victory. The path ran through London, Marseille, Venice, Constantinople, Kaffa, Samarkand, and Hong Kong. And even when the enemy acquired a face under the microscope, its shadow did not vanish. It remained in memory. When the plague left the streets of European cities, it did not leave their memory. It remained in stone, in books, in language, in images, in fears, and even in scientific terms. Its shadow still lies upon culture, and perhaps that is what makes it one of the longest-lived catastrophes in human history. In the cities of Central Europe, there still stand plague columns, tall obelisks erected in gratitude for the end of an epidemic. The most famous is the Column of the Holy Trinity on Vienna's Graben, built at the end of the 17th century by order of Emperor Leopold I. Its construction took almost 20 years. Chiseled in marble, teeming with angels and allegories, its meaning is supplication, humility, repentance. Such columns also appeared in Prague, Munich, Lviv, and Budapest. Sometimes they stand unobtrusively. Sometimes they rise over squares. But they always remind passers-by, death passed here. Inside churches and chapels, frescoes and engravings devoted to the dance of death have been preserved. Skeletons lead away bishops, kings, merchants, children. All are equal before the plague. This iconography was especially popular in the 15th century, immediately after the first wave of the Black Death. In literature, the theme of plague has shown itself with varying force. One of the earliest responses is Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the mid-14th century. Young people flee plague-stricken Florence and tell 100 tales to each other. It is not only a collection of novellas, it is culture's act of survival amid destruction. In the 17th century, Daniel Defoe, using real documents and testimonies, created a journal of the plague year, a book depicting London's plague of the year 1665. Speaking in the voice of a fictitious eyewitness, the author writes of fear, isolation, mistrust, and prayer. In painting, images of the plague grew increasingly allegorical. From the late 18th century, artists depicted not so much the disease itself as its presence in society. In the canvases of Arnold Buckland, for example, death is a figure in a boat crossing a river. In the 19th century, painters of the Romantic school produced engravings in which the plague is a spirit or shadow entering a city as people shrink back in horror. In the 20th century, the symbol of the plague became especially significant. In an age that witnessed 2 world wars and the emergence of new diseases, the plague became a metaphor for terror that arrives suddenly. In the year 1947, Albert Camus published his novel, The Plague, set in the Algerian city of Oran. It is both realistic and philosophical. Camus' characters do not seek culprits. They strive to preserve dignity, to keep working, to help others without losing their humanity. The plague in this novel is not only an illness, but also an image of Nazism, violence, and indifference. Images of the plague seeped into cinema. In Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, a knight plays chess with death against the backdrop of the plague. In Friedrich Murnau's Nosferatu, the disease arrives with the vampire. In numerous films of the 20th and 21st centuries, mass death brought by a virus borrows the plague's visual codes: protective suits, prohibitions, separation, panic. The plague remained in language as well. Phrases like plague barracks, an epidemic of fear, and a virus of panic echo what humanity has already endured. Even now, the word quarantine is associated first with the sea and with trade, for it comes from the Italian 40 giorni, the 40 days of isolation first introduced in Venice. In medicine, the plague became a starting point for many structures. It was precisely the struggle against epidemics in the early modern period that compelled cities to create sanitary commissions, medical councils, and systems of statistics. Modern health organizations owe their existence to the necessity of coordinating efforts against diseases like the plague. Each time humanity faces a new threat, whether Ebola, HIV, or the coronavirus, familiar formulas surface in the news: masks, bans, quarantine, isolation, outbreak. In this, the cultural legacy of the plague is revealed. It taught people to think in terms of biological threat, to perceive danger in the invisible, to respond to the signals of mass illness. In the year 2020, when the world plunged into the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, the plague resurfaced in the public imagination. People recalled Venetian quarantines, beaked masks, and plague pits. Social media circulated images of medieval plague doctors. Some painted them on walls, some dressed as them for Halloween. It was not merely entertainment. It was a way to cope with collective anxiety. Despite scientific advances and progress in treatment, fear of the plague has not disappeared. It has migrated to other diseases. It has sunk deeper into the subconscious. Camus wrote, "The plague bacillus never dies or disappears. It can lie dormant for decades in cupboards, in linen, in papers. And indeed, the memory of it remains in textbooks, in films, in museums, within us. It taught us to fear, but also to unite, to fall silent, but also to speak. And today, when it seems everything can be controlled, memory reminds us, not everything depends on human will, for there is still nature, there is chance, and there is the plague, not as an illness, but as a reminder of fragility." Thus ended the centuries-long history of one of the most destructive disasters. But its end is not oblivion. It is recognition, and therefore, a warning.